Hi everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. My name is Laura Sutherland. I'm the Safe Harbor Regional Navigator for Southeastern Minnesota. And what that means is every day I work with high school students that have experienced some form of sexual exploitation. And the reason that I've been out at the high school last week and this week is that we're hoping with some education on this topic that we can start to see the number of students that have been exploited start to go down. Today we're going to be talking about sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Want to just see some hands. How many of you have heard of sex trafficking? Just raise your hands if you have. Okay, good, most of you. How many of you have heard of sexual exploitation? Okay, all right, less of you, which is what we would expect. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between those two terms and what are some red flags and warning signs for both and how you can protect yourselves against both of those things. We're going to take the first 60 seconds today and have you talk about to one another what pops into your mind, what pops into your brain when you hear those two words, sexual exploitation, either from what you've heard in the media or TV shows. Just go ahead and talk to one another about what you think of when you hear those two words, sexual exploitation, starting now. Okay, we'll go ahead and bring it back. How many of you talked about or thought about nude photos? Just raise your hands if you did. Okay, that's actually right on. That's the number one form of sexual exploitation that we're seeing happen of high school students. How many of you talked about or thought about social media or the internet? Raise your hands if you did. Okay, seeing a few hands. That also is right on. That's the number one place where we're seeing sexual exploitation take place. Okay, we're going to go ahead now and take a look at how Minnesota defines sexually exploited youth. Sexually exploited youth is anyone, actually the law just changed this summer, is anyone under the age of 24. So that potentially includes all high school students who has engaged in sexual conduct. Now, when I say sexual conduct, I'm not talking about just sexual intercourse. I'm talking about all forms of sexual activity, so that can include oral sex as well, in exchange for money. Now, when I say sex in exchange for money, what do you think of? What comes into your mind? Yeah, prostitution. That's what people always say. But we know now from working with victims and survivors that particularly when it comes to students, that students are almost always lured into this, tricked into this. It might start out as a boyfriend or girlfriend relationship, a romantic relationship, but then at some point it turns into exploitation, or they might be forced into it through abuse. So now we call it for what it is, exploitation, or in its most severe form, sex trafficking. We really don't use that word anymore, prostitution. But it's more than just sex in exchange for money. It's also sex in exchange for food, clothing, shelter, drugs, alcohol, the promise of something. Now I want to focus on a couple of these things where we're seeing more exploitation take place. Starting with shelter. Can you think of some reasons why a student might not feel safe staying at home and might start to look for another place to stay? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Maybe to try to get away from whatever they're getting away from, but they're just going to end up in the same situation as that.
Yeah, so maybe they're trying to get away from something. What?
Have you seen Forrest Gump? Like Jenny? Like, you know that lady, Jenny? Not that example for Jenny, you know, like she had no shelter, so that's what she did, like went to different, not saying it like that, but an example.
Yeah, sometimes a student doesn't feel they're having a bad time at home, they don't feel safe at home. Sometimes they're physically abused. I have a number of students on my caseload who've been physically abused, and when that happens, they start couch surfing. How many of you have heard of that term, couch surfing or couch hopping? Okay, a number of you. And what does that mean? Can you tell me what that means?
Like moving from one place to the next.
Yeah, right. Going from place to place, friend's house to friend's house, looking for a place to stay. And that can be okay for a while for a student, but it doesn't necessarily always work out so well. What might be some reasons that couch surfing doesn't work out for a student? Can you think of some reasons? Yeah, right? That's one reason. Another reason is that sometimes their friend's parent doesn't necessarily want them to stay there. Sometimes those friendships can get a little weak or a little strained. And when that happens, a student can start staying with people that are a little older, maybe somebody 19, 20, 21. And over time, that person can start pressuring them to put out sexually in order to continue to stay there. Now, when that happens, the student's kind of caught in a difficult place. Because if they return home, they're physically abused. If they stay in that other residence, they have that pressure to put out sexually. When that happens, we're really recognizing that students are pretty vulnerable to that sexual exploitation. And maybe some of you have got some friends that aren't always staying at home and are doing some of this couch surfing. And maybe you haven't really thought about what's happening to them when they're not at home. But we know that the more often that a student is not at home and they're couch hopping, that their risk of exploitation definitely starts to rise. The other area where we're seeing exploitation take place is in the area of drugs. What happens to anyone once they start using drugs, student or adult? What happens when anybody starts using drugs very often? Yeah, they get addicted, right. And if they don't get help, what happens? Yeah, it gets worse. They want more. They got to feed that addiction. Now, drugs are expensive. Students can't afford drugs. Adults really can't afford drugs. But there's plenty of people who are willing to provide those drugs, but they always come at a cost. And so what we see happening is that students end up exchanging some type of sexual activity in order to get the drugs that they need to feed their habit. Now, maybe that's not always full-blown sexual intercourse, but it's some type of sexual activity, and you guys can probably imagine, figure out what that is. This is where we're seeing some of our male students also be sexually exploited because they too end up exchanging that sexual activity to get the drugs that they need to feed their habit. Now, regardless if this happens to a student once or 10 or more times, it's still exploitation. And we're not interested in anyone getting in trouble over the drugs or alcohol or not staying at home. We really just want to encourage everyone, if this is happening to you or a friend of yours, to reach out to some teacher that you trust or a counselor or myself, because we really want to break this cycle of exploitation and get students the help that they need. The other areas of exploitation include stripping and then being filmed doing sexual acts. I really want to focus on this last one in particular because this includes those nude photos. Now, before I came here, last week and this week, I had some conversations with the Austin Police Department, as well as administrators and teachers here at the school. And we know that some students, when they're involved in relationships, exchange those nude photos. But what happens to those photos when the relationship busts up? Yeah, people get exploited. Those photos, they get sent out over the internet, right? People get exposed. And is this happening just to girl students? No, right. It's happening to guys too. And in working with students, I have found that oftentimes students can kind of feel like if this has happened to them, that they have to just suffer in silence, that they got to kind of suck this up, because during the relationship, they voluntarily exchange those photos. And they're embarrassed and they're ashamed. But if this has happened to anyone, we really want you to know that no one has to suffer in silence. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, it's actually a form of exploitation to leak those photos. It's against the law in Minnesota. Two, there's steps that we can take to get those photos off the internet. And three, we can work with law enforcement to charge the student that has leaked those photos. Now, if someone has had those photos leaked and they're the subject of those photos, does that harm the student? Yes or no? Yeah, right, absolutely, of course. And why does it harm that student?
Like the future?
What?
For the future?
Yeah, it harms them for the future. It harms their reputation. They get cyberbullied. It harms them emotionally. And so we're really intentional about turning this culture around here at the high school because too many students are being hurt by this, and it's just not okay. So again, we really want to encourage you, if this has happened to you or someone you care about, let some adult know. Okay, a lot of exploitation is taking place through social media. Just like no one actually comes up to someone in the hallway and says, give me some nudes, that all happens over the internet. Other forms of exploitation are also happening through social media. Obviously, we just have listed up here some of the apps where it's taking place, but we know that all of you are using a lot of other apps as well. And social media, by and large, is a good thing. It's how all of you stay in connection with your friends. It's how the staff here at school stays connected with the people they care about. It's how I stay in contact with my friends. But people who are targeting and exploiting students take something that's good and they twist it to harm students, and they do this in a way that oftentimes we don't necessarily even realize until it's too late. Now I want to show you some examples of messages that were sent out by a guy who's in prison now. He actually considered it to be his job to exploit high school students, but it's how he made his living. But before I show you those messages, I want you to turn to each other again and talk about messages that you have received, perhaps from people you don't know, that are perhaps sexual in nature, or nude photos that you've received. This is the end of the second week that I've been here in the Austin School District, and students have shared quite a bit in terms of the kinds of messages that they've been receiving. One student shared that on one of the social media sites that she likes, a guy would continue to send her naked photos, pornographic images. She would delete those images, block him. He would find her on a different site that she liked to use, continue to send her those images. She would delete him, block him again. This continued to happen. She eventually let her dad know. He intervened, but it still continued to happen. Eventually, they had to contact the police. Yesterday, when I was doing one of these presentations, there was a whole group of guys sitting together. Every single one of them had received nude photos from girls on Snapchat and Facebook. And I make this point to say that we are aware that students are getting these messages and images, and also that it's not a student's fault, that adults are deliberately reaching out to students to try and lure them into relationships. So just want to take a minute now. Have you talked with your neighbors about kinds of messages that you're receiving, and what you think about those and how you're responding to them? So go ahead and take a minute now to do that. If you could help with some crowd control, I'd appreciate it. There's quite a bit of talking going on in the audience. It's a little distracting when I'm up there on the stage.
Super late.
Okay. So does anybody have any examples they'd like to share?
Like, what do you mean by examples?
Any kind of messages that you've received on social media from people you don't know that are flirtatious in nature or sexual in nature.
Well, someone asked me if I wanted to like do some like thing, like, you know, they asked me if I wanted to go party and like, you know, I didn't even know who it was.
How'd you respond to that?
Do I know you?
Okay.
Question mark. And
Alright.
then I don't know, they didn't answer, so I just blocked them right away.
Okay.
Well, they like read it and then they didn't even say nothing, so I blocked them.
Okay. All right. So when you received that message inviting you to party, you ended up just blocking them, which is really the best thing to do, is just block people that are trying to kind of suck you in that way. That's really the smart response. So we're going to talk about now this guy who's in prison that would send out a couple hundred messages every day. He would target students that he considered to be vulnerable in some manner. How do you think he would assess whether a student was vulnerable just by looking at their stuff on the internet? What types of things do you think he looked for on the internet?
Raw.
What?
No, like, you know, like this stuff like you'd put on
Like self-harm, like posts and stuff like that.
just put like
Low self-esteem.
Yes, he would definitely try to look at whether their sense of self-esteem was low. Other thoughts of specific things he might be looking for when he was looking at their postings? Any thoughts? What? Yeah, he definitely was looking at the things that they shared in their postings. Well, yeah. If there were things going on in their lives, things that were harder, yes, he definitely looked at that. So his list of stuff that he was looking for included the following. He would look to see if they posted like the sad emojis. He would look to see if they were not getting along with their mom or dad. He would look to see if they had broken up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend. He would look to see if they had not made a sports team, if they had bombed a test that week, if they weren't getting along with their friends, if they said something like that they didn't feel like life was worth living. I mean, posts that we've all seen, right? I mean, raise your hand if you've seen posts like that. Yeah, I mean, they're posts that we've all seen, and they're posts maybe that even we have made at times. To him, these posts were a treasure trove. They were a gold mine, because they would indicate to him that a student might be more receptive to one of the messages that he would send. And if he saw a posting like that, he would send a message like this one on Kik. He used all forms of social media, Kik, Snapchat, Facebook, you name it, he used it. So he'd send this message, which one of the victims on my caseload did respond to. Tired of your mom or dad getting on your nerves. And we know that all families go through their ups and downs and can experience, you know, what student doesn't experience their mom or dad getting on their nerves at one time or another. Or he'd send a message like this. Don't trip, sweetheart, because I ain't looking for nothing either, but a cool homegirl that ain't on no BS. And your looks is something that attracted me to you. Now, how many of you have been taught, you know, don't respond to a message from someone you don't know? You all been taught that? Yeah, I would hope so. And hopefully you wouldn't respond to a message like this. But it's human nature to feel flattered when someone you don't know compliments you on your looks. This guy would send out a couple hundred of these messages every day, hoping that even a handful of students would respond. And a handful of students always did respond. As soon as they would, he would immediately start to engage with them, try and find out their phone number, start texting them, and just start trying to build that relationship. Ask them if they had a job, where they worked, if they had younger siblings, if they had any pets. And in every single instance, this was a secret online relationship. I would imagine that a number of you have friends that also have secret online relationships where your parents have no idea that that relationship is going on online. Now, after a number of months went by, the student would actually believe that this person cared about them. But do you think that he did? No. He was just using them. He was exploiting them. And so after those months would go by, he would say, it would mean so much to me if you would just provide me with a photo, a nude photo. That would be really awesome. And do you think the student would provide it?
Yeah, 7 out of 10.
Yeah. And why do you think the student would provide the photo? What? Yeah, because the student actually believed that he cared, and they also thought it's not that big of a deal. Everybody's doing it. Once the student provided the photo, then he would have that student exactly where he wanted them. Because he would say, now you need to provide this sexual act for me, or you need to have sex with other men, and I'm going to charge you for it. And then the student would feel trapped. Because their parents already didn't know about the relationship. Their parents already didn't know that they had provided these nude photos. And the student would end up doing the things that he wanted. Now, we're telling you this because if this were to happen to any of you or someone that you know about, it's never the student's fault. We know that we have adults that are deliberately targeting and exploiting our students. And that's why it's so important to reach out and let some adult know about what's going on. Do you think that this happens just to female students? That's right. It doesn't just happen to female students. Not too long ago, we had a male high school student come into our office. He also was involved in one of these secret online relationships with a woman. He also provided her with nude photos. And he was horrified one day when the FBI showed up at his home. They had been doing an undercover operation online and discovered that the woman that he had provided the photos to actually was a man who had been soliciting these photos from a number of male high school students throughout the Midwest. Now the student had the embarrassment of his mom finding out about the relationship, the embarrassment of his mom seeing the photos, and also has to be a witness in a major FBI trial. So this is why we want you to know about what we're seeing happening to both male and female students across social media. Now that you know a little bit about how people are targeting students, I want to play for you a 911 call that came into Minnesota by a young woman who got lured into exploitation through a relationship that she had on Facebook. Happily, the officers did come to the door and she was able to get out of this situation. She did unfortunately pick up a number of sexually transmitted diseases during that time that she was being exploited. Now, as I mentioned, this all started out through Facebook. She had been targeted. She was vulnerable. She had low self-esteem and she had pretty bad home life. So when this guy started treating her like a girlfriend on Facebook, she was pretty easy pickings. And after that relationship had been going on for a while, he said, I really want to be with you. As you heard, he was in Minnesota, she was in Iowa. And he said, but there's a problem, neither one of us has any money. And so he waited for a little more time to go by, and then he said, I have an idea. He said, I could set you up with a date where you would have sex with another man, you would get paid for it, and you could use the money to buy a bus ticket to come to Minnesota. And because she was vulnerable and had that low self-esteem and actually loved him at that point, she agreed to do that. Once she got to Minnesota, he said, wow, she was so easy. She did that without ever even having met me. And so he decided to start charging her out right away. Now, what was unusual about that phone call was you could hear the terror in her voice. She honestly believed that she was going to be killed. And most women and girls, they'll never even make that call to 911 because they're so terrified they'll be killed if they're caught. But she still had some sense of self left, and so she was able to make that call and get out of this. But it all just started out with that relationship over Facebook. Now, while we're seeing a lot of exploitation happen over social media, it's not happening just over social media. We're also seeing people just approach students wherever they think they can get access to students. That could be at the shopping mall, it could be at a public event like 4th of July fireworks, wherever they think they can meet up with students and offer them something of value. That might be drugs and alcohol at a party. If it's a female student, really complimenting girls on their beauty and saying that they've got connections in the modeling industry, that they can get you a contract, but it's really all just a trick to kind of get in your good graces and then eventually exploit you. Last week when I was here after the presentations, I had a number of different students come up to me and say that this had actually happened to them. That they had someone in their 20s or late teens approach them, offer them drugs and alcohol, and that was appealing to them. So they took them up on it. But they were later sexually assaulted, blackmailed, and this set them on a pretty bad path that's been hard for them to get off of. So we just want your radar to be pretty high, that if someone you don't know approaches you and offers you something of value, they probably really don't have your best interest in mind, even though it might seem flattering at first or pretty appealing. Okay, a bunch of you indicated that you were familiar with sex trafficking. Who can tell me what sex trafficking means? Who can define it? Anyone know? All right, sex trafficking, yeah, go ahead.
So it's like, say either a girl or a guy, if they're like working for someone to get money to like make them happier.
Okay, that's a good start. Thank you. You're right. First of all, it applies to men or women, and it's when one person sells them to another person for sex and for money. But do you think the person having the sex actually ever gets to keep that money? No, that's right. Very often they're promised that they'll get to keep that money, but they never do. I've worked with many adult victims as well as student victims, and they've never seen a dime of that money. And once somebody's in trafficking, it's very hard for them to get out because they're usually beaten and they're threatened as well as their families are threatened. We're going to see a video now of a pretty typical teen who had some pretty typical problems and see how she got lured into trafficking.
Was one of the girls that was involved in our case in Oklahoma City. She was a child that came out of Wichita, Kansas, and she came from a good family. She had a mom and dad at home early in her life. She attended public schools initially, and then went on to even attend private schools. By all accounts, she was, an all-American girl. She was socialized well, educated well, and everything was going pretty good for her through her adolescence and up to her early teens, until she started to experience some issues that led her down a path that she wasn't really proud of.
Probably the year after I went to private school, I started going to public school. That was my sophomore year, and I didn't really know who I was. I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. I didn't really get along with my dad for a while, but it was just normal teenage problems, and I just get depressed at school.
Two of her friends approached her, two young kids, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old in Wichita. And they collectively, these three young girls, said, "Why don't we run away?" And she thought it was not a bad idea, and it might give her a break from what she considered to be a lot of crisis in her life. And one of the girls that she was with said, "Let me call the guy I know in Oklahoma City." And that individual subsequently traveled from Oklahoma City to Wichita, where he picked these three young girls up. Little did they know that he was a pimp.
I started to, feel uncomfortable because now I don't even know where we're going. I don't even really, I'm starting to freak out because I don't even know who this guy is. And we were driving past Wichita, going to Oklahoma City, and I was just like, I could just get up right now. I could go home and I could tell my parents I'm sorry that I left, and we could just do it all together right now. And just then, like, as he was reading my mind, he turned around and he's like, "Don't even think about asking me what you got now, you better just tuck and roll." And I was just kind of like, so I'm really going to have to die before I get to go home now.
As you take this young girl and put her in that environment and have her away from her loved ones, she's going to succumb to that pressure. There's threats of, "I will look at your family." There's threats of, "I'll show these pornographic images to everyone in this town." And he starts to control. And after a very short time, that child has no option but to stay under his command. And for them to break away and to talk to law enforcement or to call and reach out for help, they truly feel, and in some instances it would be safe to say, that their life would come to an end.
We pull over the truck stop, and it's in the alley, just right on the other side of the fence. He tells us to get out. He tells us what kind of prices we're going to charge and exactly what we're going to do. It was like 20 for a blowjob, 40 for sex, and like 8 for both. And so my friend just kind of looks at me, and she's kind of pairing me with her eyes, and I was just kind of like, "I can help you if you help me, and maybe he won't kill us tonight." So we get out of the car, and he informs us we're not going back out anyway. We're walking around, there's lots of semis, and there's also a lot of girls out there, and a lot of them are just, they look like half our age. They look like they could be like 8 or 9 years old. So we go and we're knocking on doors, and we just try to keep smiling, just try to pretend that I wanted to be there, and maybe I could just convince myself that maybe this will lead to something better, and maybe I'm seeing it wrong. And once we got inside the bed of the truck, I started to just wish I was dead or something. We get in the first truck, and the guy decides he wants me, so I go back there, and I just have to just pray to God, just please help me, just please let me do it. And then Melissa threw the wallet, and he had great kids on his ass. And all I could think about the whole time how my grandpa could be this guy right now, and how that would feel. And I just wanted to die. And I started to just think that maybe I deserve this for doing this on my parents and myself. And he didn't have enough money, so we had to go to the next one. And that guy kept his wallet. We just kept praying. And we went to 3 trucks, so we still didn't have enough money. And my friend, she was like
right. Does Angie look like a prostitute? No, no. Do you think Angie wanted to do those things? No, of course not. Now Angie was fortunate because there was a trucker at that truck stop who was a good man. And he did what a good person does in that situation. He noticed that those girls were going from truck to truck, and he intervened. He called law enforcement, and they came and they rescued those girls. Now, Angie obviously is still going to have a lot of trauma that she's going to be processing for a long time, but she was able to get out of that situation. And we're hoping that with education on this topic, that more and more people will do what a good person will do, including all of you. And that when you see exploitation happening, regardless if it's those nude photos being exchanged or something more severe like what Angie went through, that you also will intervene, that you'll speak up, and that you'll let someone know about it, so that we have fewer and fewer stories like Angie's taking place. And also we hope that it will actually start to affect our daily life and change our culture, including the language that we use. Now, how many of you are familiar with the term thought? You can just nod your head or raise your hand. For those of you who might actually not know what that word means, it stands for that hole over there. And it actually is a pretty horrific term. It comes from the sex trafficking industry. And what it means is that it means when a pimp, like the one in that video that Angie was referring to, takes a girl and disciplines her, so bloodies and bruises her and puts her in a corner at a party. And she's free in the house at night. She's free on the pimp for any guy to do whatever he wants to with her. And hopefully, maybe some of us have even used that term not really knowing what it means. But hopefully now that we know what it means, we'll be more sensitized to it and not use that. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about who are some of the folks that are engaging in exploitation. I've been doing this presentation for 2 weeks now, and people have asked me if people have done this here in Austin, if I have examples here in Austin, and I want you to know that I do. But I'm not showing those examples here today in order to protect the confidentiality of the victims in Austin. But when I do these presentations in other school districts, I do show those examples of Austin. Also, I want you to know that it's really not so important what a person looks like. We've seen people engaging in exploitation of all different ages, genders, races, and I even have victims on my caseload whose moms and dads, aunts and uncles have sexually exploited them in order to pay off a drug debt. What's important is how someone treats you. And once someone starts using you or harming you for their own benefit, that's when it's so important to really reach out for help. Now, this first example is a pretty sad case. This fellow exploited a 12-year-old and 16-year-old girl out of Rochester, and he did that by using another 16-year-old girl that he was already exploiting to invite them to a party through Facebook. Both of the girls came from pretty lousy home lives, so the idea of going to a party where there was going to be drugs and alcohol sounded like a good time to them. They all met up at the Apache Mall in Rochester, and once there, those two girls, they made a pretty big mistake. Do you know what that was? What?
Got in the car with them.
Yeah, exactly. They got into his SUV even though they had never met him. And once inside his SUV, he brutally and repeatedly raped both of the girls, threatened to kill them as well as their families if they tried to escape or contact anyone they knew on their cell phones. Now the 16-year-old, she was incredibly brave, and she did manage to escape at one point. He was eventually caught, but it took a long time. It took over a year. And last year, in a jury trial at the end of the year, he was convicted, but he brutalized a lot of teens before he was caught. We're showing you her example because she was just arrested about a month ago. And we're showing you her example to make the point that it's both men and women engaging in exploitation of both guys and girls. This guy, he would really target students who were not living at home but were engaging in that couch hopping, he would try to figure out what their basic needs were. Maybe they needed a meal at McDonald's. Maybe they needed 20 bucks. Maybe they needed some cigarettes. Whatever it was, he would meet that need. All with the idea that somewhere down the road there was going to be a payback, except the student didn't realize that. After several months would go by, he would demand the payback, and the payback was always having sex with other people for money. If the student resisted, he would beat them, assault them, videotape them while he was doing this, and then show the videotape to other people to have the student under his control. He also is now in federal prison, but he also brutalized many students. All right, we're showing you her picture to make a number of points. It was a surprise when she was arrested because she was on her high school honor roll and also head of her cheerleading squad. She was exploiting her fellow teammates. We're showing you this picture to make the point that we are seeing high school students exploit fellow high school students, and we're seeing middle school students exploit fellow middle school students. It's not just adults exploiting students. If you see a student exploiting another student, it's so important to speak up and break that code of silence that can exist among students. All right, this is a picture of a girl the first time that she was exploited. And these are her pictures over time as she continued to be exploited. You can see that she was quite significantly abused. This is not a glamorous lifestyle, but it's a very hard and difficult life. You can see that the light in her eyes just really starts to go out. We want to be able to reach all of you by that first or second photo, or ideally before any exploitation would even happen. We don't want this happening to anyone, male or female. So we've talked about how you can reach out to any adult here at the school. There's a lot of caring adults who've received training on this topic who are interested in supporting students. But also another resource for you is the number at the office where I work. That's a 24/7 crisis line. You can call that number at any time and receive support. It's a confidential, anonymous line. You don't have to say your name. You don't have to say your parents' name. You can just call in and receive support and services. The counselors will continue to have this number for some time. In the time that we have left, I just want to ask you, how many of you have younger brothers or sisters? Okay, a number of you. The youngest person on my caseload is 8 years old. And last week I had someone come into my office who was 11. We're seeing this exploitation happen at a younger and younger age. And we know that students often do not talk to their parents about what's happening to them online. But there's a good chance that they might be willing to talk to you as their older brother or sister. So really want to encourage you to share with your younger brother or sister what you learned today and let them know that you're a safe person that they can always talk to if anything inappropriate happens to them. All right, I want to thank you for being a good audience. Have a good weekend, you guys.